Here's a quick Russian language lesson for you. You know what the Russian word for water is? Voda. You know what the Russian word for vodka is? Vodka. Speaks for itself, really. You know, during the Soviet era in Russia, most bottles of vodka produced were made with no resealable cap. Once they were open, it was expected, pretty much most of the time, that the entire bottle would be sunk in a single sitting. In the bars that served vodka, you could buy enough of it to get blackout drunk for around 40 pence. Most people wanted nothing more from alcohol than to be anaesthetised, to forget the squalor they lived in under the shadow of nuclear Armageddon. And vodka was ideal for this. No pondering the vanilla overtones, hints of butterscotch, or extrapolating the fibre count of the wood the aging barrel was made out of. It simply got you drunk. No more, no less. Unsurprisingly, then, if you ask a Russian today what their national cocktail is, the answer you'll typically get, once the laughter has subsided, will almost always be Yersh, the stereotype-conforming mixture of vodka and beer. Who would have thunk? A popular way to drink Yersh is by utilising something called the chapok method, which is vodka and beer mixed in the bottle at a ratio of 1:3, smacked off the knee and chugged down in a single gulp. There's also something called the up and down method, by refilling your glass of beer after every sip with an equal amount of vodka until your glass of beer magically becomes a glass of vodka, and then on the way back up, refilling your glass with an equal amount of beer after every sip of vodka. Rather predictably then, it cannot be said that cocktails were widespread in the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Rather the opposite, they were mostly considered either a Western indulgence for the wealthy or an aristocratic idiosyncrasy with a faint whiff of their czarist past. And yet, cocktails could be found. Not very often, but often enough. Although you may be thinking, how could you ever need any other cocktail? The Yersh is perfect. The truth is that the Soviet Union produced an enormously fascinating and typically characteristic cocktail culture out of the time and place it grew out of that, unfortunately, has largely disappeared since the end of the Cold War. So, just for some context, what was then the most popular Soviet cocktail? Well, those who enjoyed the thrilling nightlife of the USSR in the second half of the 20th century resoundingly chose, when asked, the champagne Cobbler as their domestic favourite. So much so that if someone walked up to a cocktail bartender in the Soviet Union and simply asked for a cocktail, they almost always meant one of these. It appears in the first of its kind 1954 state-issued recipe reference book for public catering establishments. The man we likely have to thank for recording most of the early Soviet cocktails was the People's Commissar of the food industry, Anastas Mikoyan, who, in all honesty, seems like the one decent fellow to actually survive the entirety of the Stalinist regime. The dude just spent his entire time publishing cookbooks and working to improve the quality of Soviet ice cream. Imagine being Stalin and having that guy killed. I think even he knew that he'd be letting himself down a bit there. So, what does a Soviet champagne cobbler look like? Well, something like this. Now, a classic champagne cobbler for the Soviets starts with a simple wine goblet. Now, as far as my research tells me, all the classic sources seem to indicate that the Soviet champagne cobbler was actually built in the glass, but with the modern approach to cocktails and even the approach they were taking, shaking it does seem the more prudent method to take. And it starts, with all things, with some cognac. Not, however, cognac as we might understand it. No, this is good Soviet cognac. So, not made in the cognac region of France. Normally when the Soviets speak of cognac being used in recipes, what they're normally referring to is cognac or brandy from Armenia. Now, not being able to get any Armenian brandy, nor any brandy from ex-Soviet states, what I've instead elected to do, the closest I could get geographically at the very least, was some Asbach, some German brandy. Now, of course, East Germany was in the Soviet Union. Asbach is made in West Germany. So, you know, we're not a million miles away. Cognac is brandy is brandy. At the end of the day, it's not going to matter tremendous amounts, to be honest. We're going to start with 20 milliliters of good old Soviet cognac. Well, not Soviet cognac, German brandy in this case, but, you know. What the original recipe then calls for next is something called Yuzhny liqueur. Yuzhny translates to southern. Now, initially I thought that this might be Southern Comfort. It seemed to have a bit of a sweet herbal thing going on, and considering Yuzhny liqueur is often listed as yellow Yuzhny, I thought, could this be yellow chartreuse? But throughout the breadth of my research, I did find that Curacao did actually seem to be the closest thing to what Yuzhny could be, certainly what they were aiming for, I think. Yuzhny, or Southern liqueur, is a predominantly orange-based liqueur that I believe has a brandy base and some more herbal spicy things going on the flavour profile as well. So for our purposes, Pierre Ferrand's dry Curacao is going to be perfect for this. We are going to need 30 mils of Yuzhny or Curacao. Next ingredient, very easy, we are going to need 15 mils of simple syrup. Mine, I think, came out a little strong. I'm going to split that, maybe do like 12 mils or something. We are going to need just 15 mils of some freshly squeezed lemon juice. Interesting thing about the Soviet Union is they found it very difficult to import and keep citrus, so they actually developed quite an ingenious method of growing their own citrus, even in some of the coldest regions. So it's not unlikely that the lemons that bartenders and chefs would have had access to in the Soviet Union would have actually been from the northern Arctic regions of Russia, if you can believe it. We are going to add some ice to this, and we're going to shake. Smells delicious. I'm going to take my cocktail and I'm just going to dump it into the glass. Now, what it also calls for is some canned fruit. Some of these old sources were annoyingly vague, especially when having to be translated in what kind of fruit they meant when they just said canned fruit. I can assume they meant literally whatever you can get their hands on, considering that the Soviet Union did go through at least one famine, and they weren't exactly living in abundance during that time either. But I do believe that with the champagne cobbler, canned berries were mainly what they were going for. So I'm just going to fish out a couple of these neon cherries from this thing of canned fruit. And also, I think a couple of Amarena cherries as well will go really, really nice in here. What can I say? These Soviet bartenders often use what they had on hand. I'm doing much of the same. I think some mint is really going to complete the look. Now, in the Soviet Union, when it came to cocktails, certainly in the early Soviet Union, with places like the cocktail hall, I don't think they were garnishing pretty much anything, to be honest. However, I can, and this isn't going to change the drink too much, just presentationally, I think this is going to want a straw. And last but certainly not least, the eponymous ingredient of the champagne cobbler is some good Soviet champagne. Of course, the Soviets were making their own cognac, their own brandy, and naturally with those same grapes they were also making Soviet champagne. I did think about actually trying to source some real champagne for this, but I thought probably just the cheapest sparkling wine from my local Tesco is probably gonna be about roughly the same quality as the Soviets could make their premium champagne. Doing this on a budget for accuracy. And we're gonna top this up with roughly 50 mils of sparkling wine or Soviet champagne. And there we have it, a simple but surprisingly elegant Soviet champagne cobbler. You walk into any bar serving cocktails in the Soviet Union, not that they were very numerous, but if you ask simply for a cocktail, this is typically what they would serve you, as more often than not, this is what the customers would mean. Let's give it a try, cheers. That's fantastic. I can quite easily see how something like that would catch on as just sort of the default cocktail. Wow! Especially if those are the ingredients that you can get your hands on most easily. Obviously, we have a lot of Soviet counterparts to common Western ingredients. The cognac, the brandy, gives this a really nice, warming body that gives way to a sweet, fruity, citrusy sensation that certainly is carried by the fresh lemon juice we have in here, but also the curacao. That and the lemon, and of course the brandy base of the curacao, brings this whole thing just into a super cohesive, warming, but really refreshing and sweet, very balanced cocktail. I think the mint here is a very, very good shout. I think particularly on the nose and the whole olfactory sensation, it really brightens up the whole cocktail, especially in the presence of the sparkling wine as well. You do get that sparkling wine on the back end, but of course, because wine is also made from grapes, just as brandy and cognac predominantly is, it really lends itself to brightening up the heavier, bassy notes of the cognac and the cognac base of the curacao. The flavor profile isn't tremendously complex, but so easy to drink. And a really, really well formulated cocktail as well. Every ingredient in here is very well calculated and the drink is perfectly balanced. If you can make this at home, and it's really not that difficult, especially with how readily available all the ingredients I've used are. Soviet champagne cobbler, who would have thunk? But this cocktail is tame compared to whatever else they were whipping up back then. Just as something to whet the palate, it kind of quickly goes off the rails from here. Given this cocktail and its contemporaries only first appeared in print in the mid-1950s, it's safe to say the USSR were more than fashionably late to the cocktail game, which started in the United States around 100 years prior and even made a very brief appearance in Imperial Russia. But given the Bolshevik Revolution in 1916 was characterized by a rejection of inequality and opulence, it's no surprise that they rejected such a bourgeoisie indulgence. So just what did it take for the cocktail to finally make its way into Soviet Moscow? Cocktail culture percolated into the Soviet Union during the early 1940s, after the United States began supplying the Soviet Union with Lend-Lease goods during the Second World War. Along with trucks, tanks, and canned meat, the American officials, apparently unwilling to suffer vodka neat, should have tried some Yersh, also introduced their Soviet counterparts to cocktails. Strange, brightly mixed liquids that looked and tasted nothing like beer, wine, or even good old Armenian cognac. For Moscow's elite, cocktails were pure novelties of exotica. But for the regime, they were a prop. Bars were opened, but were Potemkin saloons, not for comrades in revolution, but visiting diplomats and businessmen in order to convince them that life under Stalin was every bit as drinkable as it was in New York or in Paris. But, naturally, like most things in Mother Russia, this veneer of genuine hospitable intent was quickly mired by their long-suffering embattled mentality. The compulsion to seek control over your enemies, and when everyone is your enemy, you'd better keep an ear to the ground. One bar in particular, the notorious so-called Cocktail Hall on Gorky Street in Moscow, embodied this better than any other. Now, it might have looked like an elegant two-story establishment with a twisted wrought iron staircase, stucco columns, expensive chandeliers, palm trees and parquet floorboards, with drinks served in faceted stemmed glasses with smooth jazz floating gracefully down from upstairs. But beware, under Stalin, it's less of a bar and more of a... Yeah. It's a trap.
I'm smiling, but I am very fucking furious.
And this is a Mayak, or lighthouse. It was invented in Moscow sometime in the late 1940s to early 1950s and was served in the cocktail hall. It's a simple pedestrian build of chartreuse, cognac and egg yolk that remained one of the most popular cocktails in Russia all the way through the 1980s. Ask for one of these in any UK pub though, and you'll probably be arrested for outright hate crimes, so just a fair warning to you.
This is Democracy Manifest.
This recipe, as with many Soviet cocktail recipes, doesn't lean on vodka, as you might expect, which in the global cocktail culture is a relatively new phenomenon. Even the Soviet bartenders realized that in the quest for flavor, vodka was rarely your friend. To start the Mayak, we are going to build the cocktail, and the glass we'll drink it in. We are going to start, very pleasingly, with some green chartreuse. Now, of course, as I hope you've cottoned onto by now, a good percentage of the recipes being used in the Soviet Union used ingredients that, on paper, seem to be common ones that we can find here in the modern day West. However, like most things, Soviet green chartreuse was an entirely different thing. The Soviet Union being relatively poor and unable to import real French green chartreuse, simply began making their own. Trying as hard as they could to stick to the original flavour of green chartreuse, the Soviet stuff came in a beautiful crystal bottle, which, according to some very non-biased Russian historians, was far more beautiful than the original. We are going to start with just a small measure, 20 mils, of green chartreuse. Unfortunately, we are just simply going to have to use the real stuff today. Although it is worth noting that the Soviet chartreuse, I believe, was 43% alcohol by volume, whilst real green chartreuse sits at 55%, so a bit of a difference there. But ultimately, I don't think will make much of a difference. You're then going to want to take an egg and extract from it just the yolk. We are going to take the yolk and just drop it down the side of the glass. We are then going to take our good old Armenian cognac, or in this case, some German brandy. Take another 20 mils. And as carefully as possible, just layer it on top of the chartreuse and egg yolk. I'm actually going to attempt to pour it off the back of a spoon. Get it to layer, great. If not. And there we have it, really simply, a Mayak, or a lighthouse. And we'll just knock the whole thing back in one. Cheers. That was their most popular cocktail. I don't know what I expected from that. That is... What do I even get from that? Immediately, strangely enough actually, the cognac or the brandy comes through quite strongly there. Immediately, yeah, I sort of get the raisiny, dried, rich fruit flavour, a little bit of oak, that immediately gives way to the sharp, sweet, bright, incredibly complex and herbal profile that the chartreuse brings, that can quite easily overtake a cocktail. But in this instance, and as quickly as I drank this, I certainly could find a little bit of evolution in there. Of course, I didn't get much of a taste of the egg yolk, that just kind of slimed its way down my throat. Beautiful. Yeah, if you had to ask me what kind of person invented that, I probably would have said a Russian person. Ugh, Jesus. The use of the egg yolk here does a fantastic job of highlighting one of the most crucial aspects of Russian drinking culture, which is the small bites of food that are an absolute necessity when booze is involved, be that sardines, pickles, or rye bread, or anything along those lines. And I think, as you can probably tell from my reaction, that the Mayak, like most things Russian, nicely ornamented, incredibly unstable, and brazenly aggressive. The Mayak perfectly encapsulates the unique brand of mixology that sprung out of the USSR, and their distinct need to put a unique spin on such a putrid American indulgence. But more interesting than how this cocktail tastes is a history of espionage, subterfuge, and Cold War tensions that it reveals.
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here, this is the war room!
The appearance of the cocktail hall at a time when even the use of a foreign word was perceived as grovelling before the West is unusual. Despite starting out as an earnest effort by Anastas Mikoyan to diversify the USSR's culinary culture, bringing over technique, recipes and equipment over from the United States, he did so during Stalin's benevolent reign of terror, and the hall's eventual use as a tool to catch dissidents puts it into a historical perspective that makes vastly more sense in the context. It's practically obvious. The cocktail hall at the time was an anomaly, a place so out of touch with its surroundings, right down to the smooth jazz flowing down from the second floor, which the authorities, seeing that as a distinctly American cacophony, were oddly not fond of. So there was something inherently dissident about the venue, made to catch the perceived enemies of the Politburo. As a result, it saw probably one of the most diverse crowds in Moscow's at the time recent history. Not all patrons were dissidents, but all dissidents found temptation on Gorky Street. And they wandered in, thinking they'd found a taste of the Forbidden West. What they'd actually found was a KGB bug zapper. For the paranoid Soviet regime, who perceived enemies absolutely everywhere, it was easier to lure the would-be dissidents out with American drinks and music rather than undertaking an exhaustive and ultimately futile goose chase. One of the cocktail hall's regular jazz musicians, Alexei Kozlov, put it perfectly. The cocktail hall existed to track down people who were interested in the West and then liquidate them somewhere else. That's not nightlife, that's pest control. And 1965 saw a surge of Western-oriented cocktail bars crop up all around the USSR, in St. Petersburg, Baku and Kyiv, to please foreigners who wanted to bear witness to the country of victorious socialism. These bars began to be called currency bars, as they tended to an exclusively foreign clientele who in turn paid in foreign currency. Naturally, these foreign guests were closely watched by plainclothes police officers, bartenders working hand in glove with the secret police, and prostitutes planted like bait to fish the unwitting diplomat for secrets on behalf of the KGB. And yet, somehow, a real and distinct cocktail culture emerged from this utter pageant of paranoia.
Shooting. No, I'm just fucking about.
Fuck's sake. So you've got a burgeoning cocktail culture in a place that reviles all things American and generally finds it difficult to import any specialty alcoholic ingredients, so what do you do? Cocktails in the currency bars and cocktail hall were made with Soviet alcohol. There were all kinds of tinctures, cordials and liqueurs with quinine, sea buckthorn, thyme, citrus, a lot of everything from all over the republics. And as long as the Soviet Union existed, so too did this approach to making cocktails. Cafes and clubs that opened in the Soviet Union from the 60s through to the 1980s, usually rock and jazz bars under the close supervision of Politburo enforcers, would often serve cocktails, and among the most popular were Soviet classics such as the Mayak. So, what were some of the true classics of the Soviet era? Returning to Mikoyan's 1954 recipe guide, which contains a veritable litany of unique cocktail recipes, it's the only real look we have into what the cocktails of the era were like, as the menu of the cocktail hall was, unfortunately, lost to time. Two of the most popular and frequently cited cocktails from the Moscow cocktail hall were the Cowboy and the Taran. These are uniquely Soviet cocktails, and intentionally so, as they use a wide variety of ingredients from all over the Soviet Union. And the Cowboy was particularly prominent in the advertising for the Moscow Cocktail Hall, as one of these could put you back by up to a tenth of a month's rent. The height of Western excess and indulgence. Bliat. Let's make a Cowboy first. A drink tailor-made to showcase the wide variety of spirits and liqueurs produced in the Soviet Union. Listen, I don't know why two of the cocktails that best illustrate an image of what cocktails were like in the Soviet Union have egg yolks in them, but they do, so let's just roll with it. We are going to build this cocktail in a port glass, and we are first going to need 30 mils of not some beautiful Armenian cognac this time, but gin of all things, or as they like to call it, a bitter juniper tincture. And interestingly, in Russian parlance, particularly before they were able to mass import alcoholic products from all over the world, any alcoholic ingredient that consisted of sort of a neutral base spirit, i.e. vodka, that is later infused with a flavour, is usually called a tincture, which is rather different from the way we would understand the word tincture to mean. We are going to need 30 mils of gin, or a bitter juniper tincture, for the old reds amongst us. We are then going to need 30 mils of something called pertsovaya, or pepper vodka. This is a really common product to find, I believe still, in modern day Russia. It's very common to have a bottle of vodka that's been infused with spicy chilies, black pepper, cloves, a little bit of honey, more as a medicinal sort of pick-me-up kind of thing, but very common throughout the Soviet Union. In fact, it was produced by quite a few distilleries. However, it's also very easy to make on your own. I did make this stuff a little bit spicy, so we'll see how we do. I'll need 30 mils. We will need 20 mils of an apricot liqueur, importantly not an apricot brandy, as in this has a base spirit of vodka or just a neutral spirit, and not cognac or brandy. And 20 mils of Benedictine, which, once again, was not something that the old Reds were readily able to import, so naturally they were making their own version. Now, of course, unable to get my hands on some good old Soviet Benedictine, I'm instead, shockingly enough, just going to have to resort to the real deal. I know, dreadful. 20 mils. And once again, an egg yolk. Why do I do this to myself? And we'll put our egg yolk straight into the cocktail. Beautiful. And there we have the poster child of the cocktail hall on Gorky Street, the Cowboy. I've learned my lesson from the Mayak, by the way. I'm not gonna shot this whole thing. That was a mistake. That's a very pleasing to look at cocktail, I'm not gonna lie. Smells apricot. I'm getting the apricot liqueur more than anything else. Let's give it a try. Cheers. Ooh. Ooh. Right up front, I get that apricot. Clear as day, that comes through super brightly. And then very quickly after that, that evolves into the spice of the pertsovaya, begins to come through. Actually, the little bit of heat you get on the backhand there is really satisfying. And then once the heat, the warmth from the pertsovaya has died down just a little bit, the sort of the sweet, woodsy, herbal thing I think Benedictine has going on really comes through quite strongly. And then just on the tail end, some of the juniper, some of the citrus from the gin. Yeah, that's like apricot. Very quickly into just pepper, spice, a little bit of the honey that's in the pertsovaya comes through. I think if I shot this whole thing, I think that would put me in a state to not be able to finish the rest of this video. And I can only eat so many raw egg yolks in a day. But there we have it, the Cowboy. The image of opulence on Gorky Street in Moscow. A pure illustration of American culture, Western indulgences, slowly percolating their way into Soviet society.
I wanted to personally thank you for all your efforts in making this partnership successful.
Let's now make a Taran. I love the concept of this cocktail, the Taran, because whilst on the surface it seems like a relatively standard build for a cocktail you might see today, in reality this one drink and all of the ingredients that make it up can tell us a really surprising amount about what it was like to live in the Soviet Union and the general state of their geopolitical standing, their trade relations, the anxieties of the Politburo, all of that. How can one cocktail do all of that, you ask? Well, let's find out. Now, this cocktail, the Taran, does actually call for the use of a shaker, so I must gladly oblige. First thing we are going to need is some Soviet chartreuse. I'd like to call it red chartreuse, but it's not. And yet again, I must apologize for cheaping out and not using authentic Soviet chartreuse, and instead just using the real stuff. Again, I can only apologize. 15 mils. We are going to need 5 mils of mint liqueur, or in this case, a creme de menthe, which again was something not imported, but something they would much rather make themselves. Self-reliance and never leaning on anything American, Western, or foreign was such a huge part of Soviet mentality. Just this constant extension of the mindset that still exists in Russia today, this embattled mentality. It's us against the world, so I would rather die than import some creme de menthe from Brighton. 5 mils of mint liqueur. I think that's about a bar spoon. We are going to need 5 mils of our pepper vodka, or pertsovaya. Again, something still, I think, widely consumed in Russia today. Common household, medicinal, curative. And then the next thing we're going to need is, this is quite exciting, this is something called starka. Starka is a type of infused spirit that was produced in the Soviet Union, specifically produced in Lithuania. Starka has its origins in the long-missed Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. But of course, as Russian imperialism expanded and the Commonwealth fell apart, Lithuania and Poland were eventually subsumed by the Soviet Union. And so with it, also was Starka. And this stuff is really, really interesting. Essentially, they take a neutral spirit, a vodka, they age it for about 3 years in wooden barrels, which brings it relatively closely to a whiskey. And then they'll sweeten it just a little bit, flavour it with a couple of herbs and spices sometimes, but predominantly with pear and apple leaves. This almost resembles a kind of brandy or cognac, but it's a little lighter, a bit more fragrant. It's really, really nice stuff. So here we have some Lithuanian Starka. I was actually able to get an ingredient from an ex-Soviet state. So there we go. We are going to need just 5 milliliters of lemon juice. I'm probably going to give it just a touch more. We are going to add some ice and we're going to shake. Beautiful color. Now this is quite a diminutive cocktail, so we're just going to need a small glass. And I'm just going to dump this in. We are also going to want some canned fruit in the Taran, but like the champagne cobbler, the Taran is even more vague as to what kind of fruit you can put in it. So I took that to mean as just whatever canned fruit you have on hand you can get your hands on. So whatever was in this canned fruit I bought from Tesco is going in the Taran. I think there's some peach, some pineapple, a bunch of stuff in there. And again, I think the addition of canned fruit and compote to so many cocktails in the Soviet era redounds greatly to this concept of always following up a drink with a bite of food. There's food even in the cocktails. And I think simply because it'll look nice, I'm just going to give it a sprig of mint. There is creme de menthe in here, so it's not entirely an insane thing to do. I'm going to elect to not give this a straw, so here we are. This is the Taran. Let's give this a try. Cheers. Ooh. That is really bracingly refreshing. The stark of that infused aged vodka comes through quite strongly in the beginning, but in the context of that tiny bit of creme de menthe and the chartreuse gives it this immediate, very bracing, almost icy kind of refreshing sensation. But this is, I mean, on the nose, that chartreuse comes through really strongly. It has a very distinctive smell. And on the taste, you get that chartreuse, but really kind of lengthened and brought out. It's not too overpowering at all, like we found out in the Mayak. This is very bright. You get the sort of the fragrant olfactory sensation of the pear and apple leaves. A little bit of the age from that barrel, the little bit of lemon in there, really nicely rounds out some of the sharper, more unctuous edges from the quite sweet ingredients we have going on here. And Astas McCoyan, you might have been onto something, my dude. You might have been onto something. I mean, the Taran really is, in essence, the story of the Soviet Union in a glass. Later, after the Soviet Union's first official bartenders began to work, they developed their own distinct line of cocktails. In the 1960s, the Soviet Union decided that they couldn't have the rival West thinking things weren't absolutely perfect and even more cultured and sophisticated than them, so it opened up a bartending school in the InTourist or currency bars. Here, Alexander Kudryavtsev, who answered a Komsomol radio ad, became the Soviet Union's first official bartender by learning how to mix drinks from a pre-revolutionary veteran and was sent off to capitalist Finland for practice. He came back and began training bartenders who spread the gospel of mixology all over the USSR. In fact, there was a whole litany of cocktails that I really wanted to showcase in this video that I was ultimately unable to due to the cocktails being discontinued since the collapse of the Soviet Union or because of trade sanctions put on Russia due to their ongoing war in Ukraine. As well as simply a whole host of ingredients that are made in the Baltic countries that are just generally difficult to get up here in Scotland. The culinary culture of a country or peoples can often tell you a surprising amount about how they live and what life is like on a day-to-day basis. But it's the cocktails unique to the USSR that really highlight the stark differences between the drinking culture in the West, i.e. Europe and America, and in Russia, as well as telling us an enormous amount about the deeds of the Soviet government and the socio-political mindset of the general population. After the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, the rest of the Soviet Union fell like a Rube Goldberg machine of self-pity, and the newly capitalist Russian Federation began importing bottles and recipes from the rest of the world. Very quickly, the distinctive cocktail culture fostered by the USSR's isolation and aspiration faded away like the consequences from decades of tyranny under Stalin. But with Russia's current imperialist campaign to restore the old Soviet borders by waging an all-out war in Ukraine and a hybrid war with everyone else to the west, the Muscovites once again find themselves pariahs, isolated by the West but living a nostalgic reprise of Stalinist ideals. Maybe, then, in the not-too-distant future, the Soviet style of mixing drinks will make a resurgence, and cocktails like the Mayak will once again reign in glorious supremacy. Do svidaniya.